Welcome back, warriors. So, I enjoyed reading about your favorite foods from yesterday. Thank you all for playing along. Hopefully, you realize how interconnected our food supply is and how much it has changed as a result of the Columbian Exchange. Today, we're going to be talking about another aspect of the Columbian Exchange, and that is the demographic collapse of the New World. Um, one of the not just unfortunate, that's too small a word for it, horrific results of the Columbian Exchange and continued contact from Afro-Eurasia with the Americas was the death of a huge percentage of the population of native populations in the Americas. So, as you might guess from our title screen, this is kind of a downer of a lesson. I am sorry for that. But it is a topic that is really critical that we understand and that we talk about and that we don't minimize what contact does. Now, obviously, there's a difference between deliberate violence against a group of people for the purpose of their extermination, which we're definitely getting to today. But we will also be talking about things that really were not the direct fault of any one person. In the same sort of way that with the current pandemic, we can't really say, hey, it's somebody's fault why this happens. Viruses mutate and they jump from species to species. This is what they do. They don't particularly care about human beings. In the same sort of way, smallpox and other diseases didn't particularly care about the host that they infected. They just did. So here we go. Let's talk about the Great Dying. So, because of the geographic isolation that so many native populations in the Americas populations in the Americas faced, that separation from Afro-Eurasia was really critical. They also didn't have a whole lot of domesticated animals, and that meant that they were actually exposed to fewer diseases that began in domesticated animals and then jumped species, as is common for disease. People in the Americas really didn't live in close concert with those sorts of animals. They didn't have cattle, they didn't have horses, no pigs, no sheep, no goats, nothing like that. They had turkeys, but turkeys usually they kept penned out somewhere else. Ducks they domesticated dogs, but very few diseases jumped directly from dog to human. Additionally, they domesticated in South America the llama, the alpaca, the vicuña. But again, they didn't live in close concert with those animals in the same sort of way that people in Afro-Eurasia lived closely with theirs. And so the diseases that these groups of people were exposed to were radically different. In Afro-Eurasia, people had been exposed to things like tuberculosis, influenza, measles, and smallpox, and they were deadly. This is the pre-antibiotic era. There is no understanding of germ theory. People assumed that if you got malaria, it was because of bad, aria, bad air. That the reason you got sick was because there was some sort of thing in the air. They didn't really understand about disease. But one thing we have to remember is that diseases move faster than human beings do. Unfortunately, we have very close understanding of that right now, right? Where essentially what can happen is one person who has the disease can travel someplace and sneeze or touch something, and then that disease can be spread from that point of contact to a million others very, very quickly. And while it's difficult for us to know what the population of Native people were in the Americas prior to contact in 1492, we have some rough estimates. They are wildly different depending on what sources you're working from. The low end of the estimate says 18 million people, and this is a pretty conservative, very conservative estimate, and it's a pretty old-fashioned number actually as well. This was kind of the working number that we had, just kind of based off of how many Native people are still around today. But there has been some more recent scholarship that suggests that the Americas were far more densely populated than we had previously thought, perhaps up to even 100 million people at the time of contact. But regardless of how big the population was, at the end of the day, Contact was a disaster for Native people in the Americas. And most current estimates assume that at least 80 to 95% of the people who were native to the Americas had died by the 1600s. That is 80 to 95% of the population of native people all throughout the Americas were dead by the 17th century. And that death is one of the great demographic tragedies of human history. When we say demography, we mean population. Demo meaning people, graphic meaning how you describe or write it. So demographic collapse is the collapse of populations. So this right here is from the Florentine Codex. It is a document that was written by, or rather illustrated by native people in Mexico shortly after conquest. And what you can see here is the depiction of somebody who is ill. Whenever you see these sort of curls coming out of people's mouths in, like right here as well, in native illustrations from Mesoamerica, that means they're speaking. It's like a speech bubble. It's hard for us to determine what disease this person might be infected with. The assumption has always been smallpox, but we assume as well there could have been outbreaks of measles and a number of other diseases that would have caused such skin irritations. Now, the Spanish did keep some records of disease outbreaks that occurred immediately after contact. And we can see this in terms of their population losses that they're recording in central Mexico alone. And what we can see here is that these population figures are in the millions, okay? And this is telling us what the population of native people in just central Mexico would have been. And it's kind of correlating that with descriptions that had occurred in Spanish sources about outbreaks of diseases. So you have a disease, you have smallpox and possibly measles, a reoccurrence of smallpox again, a disease known as coccoliziti, which I do not know what it is. You'll notice here we're talking about the Black Death again, the bubonic plague has broken out again, possibly hantavirus, influenza, measles, again, just a litany of diseases that repeatedly devastated populations until by the 17th century, the population of native people in central Mexico was under 1 million. Now, when you contrast what is occurring post-Columbian exchange around the world, like populations are radically different depending on where we're talking about. So if we look at the effects of the Columbian exchange in terms of the population of China, you'll notice that in China, the population goes from 70 million to 110 million after the Columbian exchange, by about 100 years after the Columbian exchange. And by the time we get to about 300 years after the Columbian exchange, the population in China has accelerated massively. It's gone up to about 330 million people. In India, we can see a similar increase going from 74 million to 145 million to 180 million. In Europe has a massive gain as well, moving from 52 million in 1400 to seeing almost a tripling of that population by 1800. In sub-Saharan Africa, the story is a little bit different. The population is quite low, with 60 million people estimated at 1400 CE, but 100 years following contact with the Americas, the population in sub-Saharan Africa has also gone up. That again, just like in China, India, and Europe, is due to food supplies. It's the increased amount of calories available from things like sweet potatoes and corn and potatoes, all sorts of foods that were new and exciting and allowed for populations to increase. But you will notice that by 1800, the population in sub-Saharan Africa has fallen. And that is due to the slave trade. And we are going to be talking about that right there tomorrow. But when we compare the populations of the old world, which broadly, at least with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, saw an increase in population as a result of the Columbian exchange, the Americas did not. Latin America in particular, I'm only focusing on the Spanish occupied territory here. Actually, also the Brazilian occupied territory, Portuguese occupied territory. We can talk about here the population. If we go with a conservative 36 million estimate for how many people were in just Latin America prior to colonization and contact, by 1600 the number has dropped to 10 million, and by 1800, right at the turn of the 19th century, that population still has not recovered. It is still not back to where it was prior to contact. And in that regard, we can really think about the effect of the Columbian Exchange as perhaps genocidal. So, okay. There were other causes of demographic collapse in the Americas other than just straight up disease, which was the largest cause. There was also warfare and violence, and for a very, very long time, this was the reason that a lot of scholars attributed the collapse of native populations in the Americas to. It was something that we call La Leyenda Negra, the Black Legend, and it was kind of this idea that, like, Spanish brutality, in particular the Spanish, not just, like, specifically the Spanish, and there's a lot of reasons why this comes about, and it had a lot to do with some like pretty gross like racism with regards to like Europeans, but regardless, this was something called the Black Legend, and it was this idea that the Spaniards were somehow like singularly brutal and like would attack native populations, and they did, but the overwhelming killer of indigenous people was disease. But you also saw warfare between indigenous communities. I mean, think about the Inca. They were attacked not by the Spanish initially, but by disease that weakened their civil society, it weakened their political system, it led them into a civil war, and that civil war caused warfare between different factions of the indigenous Incan community. And then you also had indigenous communities trying to resist European colonization, which they did fiercely. Nobody likes to be colonized or to be conquered, and people fight back. But when one side has guns and cannons and horses, and the other side is fighting with clubs and obsidian swords, like, one side's gonna lose. The other big deal, like I was talking about here, is the political instability caused by epidemics. Even in places where you didn't have civil war breakout, you still had cases where leaders died due to things like smallpox and influenza, and that caused like political chaos, and it prevented people from being able to unite against the Europeans, and it made them easier to conquer. Additionally, the spreading diseases made Amerindians, these native populations in the Americas, vulnerable. And when people are afraid of a pandemic, this feels very real at the moment. When people are afraid of diseases, they spread out, which is the correct response to prevent the distribution of disease. Social distancing has historical roots, and it works. But when you spread out, when you distance yourself from other people to make sure you don't get the plague, to make sure you don't get smallpox, to make sure you don't get COVID-19, it makes it difficult to organize. It makes it difficult to protest. It makes it difficult to go to war, because all of those things require that people gather together in close concert. And when you distance yourself to avoid outbreaks, you prevent people from being able to do that. Now, this is not to say that indigenous people just kind of like ran into the hillsides and isolated themselves and did not try to resist. They absolutely did try to resist. There were widespread revolts in the Caribbean, in the American Southwest, particularly in what is today New Mexico, in Mexico proper, and in Peru, but none of them were successful long term. It's one thing to fight an invader. It's another thing to fight an invader with superior technology while you are dying of disease. This is very difficult stuff for people to do. And then the other thing that we have to wrestle with today is the labor systems developed in colonial Latin America. And I'm going to talk about this today rather than tomorrow, even though tomorrow we're really talking about enslavement, because this is not slavery. But it is really horrible just the same. So bear with me, I'm going to put up a different video just on this idea, and then we will continue.